For 30 years, Western defense planners built their worst-case scenarios around one assumption. Russia's air force was lethal, it was vast, and in any serious military confrontation, it would dominate the skies. That assumption is now in pieces. What 3 years of documented warfare in Ukraine have revealed, not through speculation, not through propaganda, but through battlefield evidence, flight data, munitions analysis, and the sober assessments of Western military institutions, she is something that has left experts in Washington, London, Brussels, and beyond genuinely struggling to reconcile what they see with what they believed. Russia's aerospace forces, the VKS, an organization that inherited the full weight of Soviet military aviation doctrine, Soviet aircraft engineering, and Soviet strategic ambition, has failed, not partially, not in isolated incidents. Systematically, structurally, and in ways that go to the very foundation of how Russian air power was conceived, resourced, and operated. The numbers tell part of the story. Russia entered the war in Ukraine with an air force of approximately 1,500 fixed-wing combat aircraft, one of the largest inventories on Earth. Ukraine had almost none. By every conventional military doctrine, Russia should have achieved air superiority within days. It should have grounded Ukrainian air defenses, paralyzed command infrastructure, and cleared the path for its ground forces with the kind of overwhelming aerial dominance that defines modern warfare. None of that happened. Instead, Russian jets retreated from contested airspace. They began launching missiles and glide bombs from distances so far behind the front lines that their crews never once faced a credible threat from Ukrainian aircraft. The close air support missions that are the backbone of combined arms warfare, the low-altitude, high-risk strikes that modern air forces train relentlessly to execute, were largely abandoned. And the losses that Russia has absorbed in aircraft, inexperienced pilots, in irreplaceable maintenance personnel, those losses have triggered a quiet but profound reassessment inside every major Western defense ministry. Now, that reassessment is no longer quiet. American experts are using language in public forums that, even 2 years ago, would have been considered analytically reckless. The words being used are not hedged. They are not diplomatic. Russia's air force, they say, is dangerously weak, and the West spent decades not seeing it. The implications of that failure of intelligence and assessment extend far beyond the skies over Ukraine. They reach into NATO's eastern flank strategy. They reshape the calculus of deterrence. They raise urgent questions about Chinese military capabilities and whether the West is making the same analytical errors about Beijing that it made about Moscow. This is a story about military power, institutional failure, and what happens when the fog of Cold War mythology finally lifts. Stay with us. If this analysis matters to you, subscribe now and turn on notifications. The strategic picture is being redrawn in real time. To understand why the exposure of Russia's air force weakness is so shocking to the Western defense establishment, you have to understand what the West believed and why it believed it so completely for so long. The story begins not in Ukraine. It begins in the wreckage of the Soviet Union. 1991. The USSR collapses. The Russian Federation inherits the largest air force ever assembled by a single nation, thousands of aircraft, hundreds of air bases, a pilot training pipeline that produced some of the most technically demanding aviators in the world, and a military aviation industrial complex that stretched across 12 time zones. It also inherits something less visible but equally consequential, a doctrine. A way of thinking about air power that was fundamentally different from the West's, and that difference would matter enormously in the decades that followed. Soviet air doctrine was not built around the independent, initiative-driven mission command model that defines American and NATO air operations. It was hierarchical, centralized. Pilots were trained to execute assigned missions within narrow parameters. Improvisation was not rewarded. Tactical flexibility was not the point. The system was designed for a specific kind of war, a massive, pre-planned, coordinated assault, and it was optimized for that war alone. When the Soviet Union fell, that doctrine did not fall with it. It calcified. 1994 to 1996. The First Chechen War. Russia's air force performs poorly in complex urban and mountain terrain. Aircraft are lost to outdated air defense systems. Mission coordination is chaotic. Western analysts note the problem, but attribute them to post-Soviet economic collapse and temporary degradation. The assumption, once Russia rebuilds its defense budget, the Air Force will recover. 1999. The Second Chechen War and the Kosovo conflict. Russia watches NATO's air campaign against Yugoslavia with deep institutional attention. 78 days of precision strikes. No NATO pilots lost to enemy action. Infrastructure destroyed with surgical accuracy. It is a demonstration of what a modern, networked, precision-guided air force can do. Russia takes note. Russia announces modernization programs, and the West, watching those announcements, updates its threat assessments accordingly. 2008, Georgia, Russia's brief war against Georgia offers the first real post-Soviet combat data point. The Air Force loses several aircraft to Georgian air defenses, which are modest by any standard. Coordination between air and ground forces is visibly poor. But Russia wins the war quickly, the international community moves on, and the deeper lessons go largely unlearned inside the Russian military establishment. 2015, Syria. This is the moment that cements Western fear of Russian air power. Russian aircraft deploy to Syria and begin a sustained bombing campaign in support of the Assad government. The images are dramatic. The message, that Russia is back as a global military power, lands precisely as intended. What the Syria campaign actually demonstrated, with the benefit of hindsight, was something different. Russian aircraft were operating in uncontested airspace against an enemy with no meaningful air defenses, dropping largely unguided munitions on fixed targets. It was not a test of modern air combat capability. It was a demonstration of presence. The West saw what it expected to see. 2022. February 24th. Russia launches its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. NATO intelligence agencies, drawing on decades of threat assessments, satellite data, and the Syria precedent, anticipate rapid Russian air dominance. Some Western analysts privately assess that Ukraine's air force will be neutralized within 48 to 72 hours. Day 1 passes. The Ukrainian Air Force is still flying. Day 3, still flying. Day 7, Ukrainian Su-27s and MiG-29s, Soviet-era aircraft that Russia's military should be able to counter in its sleep, are still conducting combat operations. The first cracks in the established picture appear. And with each passing week of the conflict, those cracks widen into a chasm that the West can no longer paper over with optimistic assumptions. The reassessment that follows is not comfortable. It is not quick, and it is not finished. Let us go inside the evidence. Let us examine with precision exactly what Russia's Air Force has done and failed to do over more than 3 years of continuous combat operations. Because the case for systemic weakness is not built on a single dramatic failure. It is built on a relentless accumulation of documented, verifiable operational patterns that point in one unmistakable direction. The standoff problem. From the earliest days of the invasion, Russian pilots adopted a behavior that contradicted every assumption Western planners had built into their threat models. Rather than penetrating Ukrainian airspace to conduct the kind of deep strike and close air support missions that define effective air power, Russian aircraft pulled back. They began launching weapons from well inside Russian or Belarusian territory, sometimes from distances exceeding 100 kilometers from their intended targets. This was not a tactical choice born of confidence. It was a defensive posture born of fear. Specifically, fear of Ukrainian ground-based air defense systems, many of them Soviet-era S-300 batteries that Russia's own military had supplied to Ukraine decades earlier, and that Russian electronic warfare and suppression systems proved incapable of reliably neutralizing. The implications of this standoff posture are profound. An air force that will not enter contested airspace cannot provide close air support to ground troops. It cannot conduct battlefield interdiction with precision. It cannot respond dynamically to changing ground conditions. It is, in operational terms, an air force that has voluntarily surrendered its most decisive capabilities. What Western analysts say happened, according to assessments published by institutions including the Royal United Services Institute in London, the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, and the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Russia's operational failure in the air domain breaks down into 4 distinct and compounding categories. First, pilot flight hours. Russian combat pilots average dramatically fewer annual flight hours than their NATO counterparts. American F-15 and F-16 pilots typically log 150 to 200 flight hours per year. Credible estimates of Russian VKS pilot averages before the war ranged from 60 to 100 hours annually, and in some units, substantially less. Flying is a perishable skill. Pilots who do not fly do not develop the instinctive situational awareness that combat demands. Second, precision munitions. Russia entered the war with a stockpile of precision-guided weapons that proved far smaller than Western estimates had assumed. Within weeks of the invasion, Russian aircraft were increasingly relying on unguided free-fall bombs, the same category of weapon used in the Second World War. The introduction of Soviet-era bombs fitted with glide kits, known as KAB glide bombs, partially compensated for this deficit. But it also confirmed that Russia's precision strike inventory had been consumed far faster than its industrial base could replace it. Third, electronic warfare integration. Russia's electronic warfare capabilities were widely considered among its most sophisticated military assets. In practice, the integration of electronic warfare support with air operations proved fragmented and inconsistent. Ukrainian forces adapted their air defense tactics faster than Russian electronic warfare units could counter them. Fourth, command and control. Multiple documented incidents revealed catastrophic coordination failures between Russian air assets and ground forces. Friendly fire incidents, missed strike windows, aircraft arriving over targets after ground situations had already changed beyond recognition. The centralized, inflexible command doctrine inherited from the Soviet era proved not merely inadequate, it proved actively dangerous. What Russia says. Moscow's official position has been consistent throughout the conflict. The VKS is performing its assigned missions with precision and effectiveness. Russian state media has repeatedly broadcast footage of strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure, military positions, and logistics nodes as evidence of air power competence. Russian military analysts aligned with the Kremlin argue that the standoff posture is not weakness, it is rational force preservation in the face of Western-supplied air defense systems that have fundamentally altered the battlefield calculus. They point to the sustained campaign of cruise missile and drone strikes against Ukrainian cities and power infrastructure as proof that Russia's aerospace forces retain decisive strategic reach. There is a kernel of operational truth in this framing. The missile and drone campaign has inflicted genuine strategic damage on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, but it is also the argument of an air force that has abandoned the core missions, air superiority, close air support, battlefield interdiction, that define air power in modern warfare. The uncertainty that remains. What no outside analyst can assess with confidence is the true state of Russia's aircraft reserves, its pilot replacement pipeline, and its capacity to reconstitute degraded capabilities over the medium term. Russia's defense industry has demonstrated a capacity to sustain production under sanctions pressure that surprised many Western economists. The weakness is confirmed. The permanence of that weakness is the open question that keeps NATO planners awake at night. The exposure of Russia's Air Force weakness is not merely an interesting footnote to the war in Ukraine. It is a strategic earthquake, one whose aftershocks are being felt in every defense ministry, every military planning cell, and every alliance headquarters across the entire international system. To understand why, you have to understand what air power actually means in modern warfare, not in the abstract, in the concrete, operational life and death terms that military commanders use when they plan campaigns and allocate resources, what air power does and what Russia cannot do. Modern air power is not primarily about bombing cities. That is its most visible application and in many ways its least sophisticated one. What air power does at its highest operational level is something more fundamental. It controls the environment in which all other military activity occurs. An air force that achieves dominance over a battlefield shapes everything that happens below it. It allows ground forces to maneuver without fear of attack from above. It destroys enemy supply lines before they reach the front. It eliminates command posts, communications nodes, and logistics infrastructure with precision that ground artillery cannot match. It provides real-time intelligence that transforms the speed and accuracy of every other military operation. Russia cannot do these things over Ukraine, not reliably, not consistently, not at the scale that its force size would suggest it should be capable of. That operational failure has had direct, measurable consequences on the ground war. Russian ground forces have been forced to operate without the air cover that modern combined arms doctrine demands. Supply columns move exposed. Command infrastructure disperses rather than concentrates. The tempo of Russian offensive operations is constrained by the absence of effective air interdiction against Ukrainian logistics and reinforcement routes. This is not theoretical. This is the documented operational reality of the war, and it represents a fundamental degradation of Russian military power that extends far beyond the air domain. The NATO Eastern Flank Recalculation. For the past 2 decades, NATO's Eastern Flank strategy, the defense of Poland, the Baltic states, Romania, and Bulgaria against potential Russian aggression, was built on a specific threat model. That model assumed Russia could achieve rapid air superiority over the Baltic region within days of any conflict. It assumed Russian air power could paralyze NATO reinforcement corridors. It assumed that NATO would need to fight through a contested air environment of extraordinary lethality. Those assumptions are now being systematically revised. NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Europe and the alliance's strategic planning staffs are working through the implications of a Russian air force that appears, in sustained combat conditions, to be incapable of projecting the kind of air power that the threat model assumed. The Baltic Air Policing Mission, NATO's rotational deployment of fighter aircraft to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, has long been considered a tripwire rather than a genuine deterrent. The implicit assumption was that in any serious conflict, Russian air power would rapidly overwhelm the small NATO presence. That assumption no longer holds with the same confidence it once did. The geographic dimension. Russia's air power weakness has specific geographic implications that matter enormously for the alliance's defensive posture. The Suwalki Gap, the narrow land corridor between Poland and Lithuania that connects NATO's Baltic members to the rest of the alliance, has been the single most studied piece of terrain in NATO strategic planning for a decade. Russian air power was considered the decisive instrument that could close the gap before NATO could reinforce. If Russian air power cannot perform at the level that threat assessment assumed, if Russian pilots will not enter contested airspace, if precision munitions are depleted faster than they can be produced, if command and control collapses under the pressure of dynamic operations, then the strategic calculus of the Suwalki Gap changes fundamentally. This does not mean the threat disappears. Russia retains nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, and a ground force that, despite severe losses, remains large. But the specific air power component of the Russian threat, the component that shaped NATO's Eastern defense architecture for 2 decades, has been exposed as substantially less capable than feared. The industrial dimension. Perhaps the most strategically significant long-term implication of Russia's Air Force weakness is what it reveals about the Russian defense industrial base. Russia cannot rapidly replace lost aircraft. The Su-34 strike aircraft, Russia's most capable modern strike platform, is produced at a rate of approximately 10 to 20 airframes per year under normal conditions. Sanctions have disrupted the supply of Western microelectronics that Russian precision weapons depend upon. The production of replacement pilots and experienced, well-trained combat aviators takes years, not months. The weakness that has been exposed is not a temporary operational setback. It reflects deep structural deficiencies in training, industrial capacity, and doctrinal development that accumulated over 3 decades and cannot be corrected quickly. NATO is looking at a Russian air force that may be weaker in 2026 than it was in 2022, and that realization is reshaping the alliance's strategic priorities in ways that will define European security for a generation.